Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask-strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie, and this is episode number 989 for January 29th, 2023. Coming up in a few minutes.
If you claim authenticity, that actually backfires and hurts you. So once you lose it, if you make this overt effort to try to regain it or get it back, I think people are immediately jaded and see that as sort of a disingenuous attempt.
What's authentic and what's not when it comes to whiskey? Is a grain-to-glass whiskey more, quote, authentic than a sourced whiskey, or is it all in the eye of the beholder? Stanford professor Glenn Carroll and Tulane University professor Cameron Verhaal studied authenticity as it applies to craft distilling, including a survey of whiskey drinkers. They'll join me later on WhiskyCast In-Depth to discuss their findings. We'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, Behind the Label, and...
I'll prop this door open. I'll open up that mash tun, see if anyone is brave enough to put their head in. And if not, you can run on into our inner sanctum.
The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
Hey friends, Gabriel Cardarella here with Dewar's Scotch Whisky, and I can't wait to introduce you to the new Dewar's 12-year hitting shelves this holiday season. More a little later in this episode of WhiskyCast.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast. Ever wondered where Redbreast got its name? Well, let's go back to 1912 and be glad our bird-watching founder didn't spot the bar-tailed godwit that day. Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by the Dalmore. Irish whiskey tourism rebounded from the pandemic in a big way during 2022, with a 425% increase over 2021, when visitor experiences were still under lockdown orders for most of the year.
The style of making single pot still Irish whiskey actually came from back in the 18th century. And that was while Irish distillers primarily at the time would make malted whiskey.
677,000 people took tours like this one at the Shed Distillery in Drumshanbo during 2022, according to a new report from the Irish Whiskey Association. That created about 400 jobs around Ireland and Northern Ireland for tour guides, restaurant workers, and gift shop employees, not to mention the impact on the larger economy. 30,000 people visited the Shed in 2022, despite its remote location, and bringing more tourists to Drumshanbo was part of the reason that P.J. Rigney opened the Shed in the first place, according to Visitors Center Deputy Manager Michael Cassidy.
Community and heritage is very important to PJ Rigney here, and what he's developed and built here. It's the community comes together and it encourages employment in the area. So without tourism, it does have a knock-on effect. So we're privileged to have a centre like this in Drumshanbo to attract tourists in the local area.
The 2022 numbers are still down from pre-pandemic totals. Slightly more than 1 million visitors toured Ireland's distilleries in 2019. William Lavelle heads up the Irish Whiskey Association.
Don't forget, at the start of the year, we were still in a pandemic phase. So really robust recovery in tourism. Tourism is so important. It's not just about the cash flow. It is a great way of promoting Irish whiskey to our international visitors to the island of Ireland. As I have said, tourism is about us putting our authenticity on display. You know, you can come in. It's like buying a new car and looking into the hood and kicking the tyres. You can come in. You can see the process that has been made. And, you know, our distilleries are doing a fantastic job in, I suppose, diversifying the experiences. And you go to different distilleries and they'll focus on cocktails. You go to different distilleries and they'll talk to you about, they'll bring you into the warehouses. Others might bring you to the barley field where the grain is grown. So there's a real depth and diversity to Irish whiskey tourism. And what we're seeing this year, we launched our Irish Whiskey Passport, and I must give a shout out to our friends in the Kentucky Distillers Association who actually gave us advice on their bourbon trail. We launched it in a pilot phase. We built it up this year. I think and what we're seeing is that's leading to what we're seeing is more and more whiskey lovers are coming to Ireland, not just to visit one distillery, but to take in that depth and diversity and visit many distilleries. And, you know, I think the future is bright for Irish whiskey tourism.
1850s, 1860s, you know, that Ireland was pretty much providing about 60% of the world's supply of whiskey. Okay, the original distillery just down the road behind my shoulder back in 1887 was producing slightly more than 2 million gallons of liquid a year. So phenomenal.
Part of that diversity can be found in Dublin. For instance, Diageo's Roe & Co. distillery used the pandemic to take a fresh look at its tours. Kevin Hurley is in charge of the distillery's visitor experiences.
Previous to COVID, we used to do one type of tour, which was called the Powerhouse Tour. And we very quickly learned that the old tour style that we used to do probably didn't serve the guests that were coming through the gate. So we took the opportunity of COVID and the lockdown to reassess what we were giving to people and try and make it a bit more tailored, I suppose, to the two types of people that come through. And by that I mean we usually get, we say, the uninitiated in whisky, those who are falling into the category, who want to explore and learn new ways to drink whisky, who might not want all of the big heavy facts and figures about how whisky is made, or they have a more casual, I suppose, interest in whisky at this point in their whisky journey. Our second type of customer that came by are those whisky enthusiasts and are enjoying the resurgence of Irish whisky and want to come by and see what Roe & Co. specifically is doing different to some of the other Irish distilleries that they might have been to already, or they might be going to while they're here in Ireland. And our old tour didn't really serve either. It was probably pitched a little bit too in depth for the casual enthusiast who wanted to learn about the category, and probably pitched a little bit too basic for the whisky geek, as we self-reference ourselves. Those who are really interested in the intricacies of whisky. So we split the tour into two, and we offer both now on a regular basis throughout the days. We have the flavours experience for those who are new to the category, and we've got the blending experience for those who want to dive in a little bit deeper. So the blending experience, when we go onto the distillery floor or above the distillery floor, we talk more about the facts and the figures and the intricacies of what makes Roe different to maybe some of our neighbours who are distilling in the area or in Ireland.
Other distilleries like to talk about their differences too. Just a few blocks away at the Dublin Liberties Distillery, Stephanie Shen's tours can take a darker side.
One of the things that really sets us apart is that we're not afraid to delve into the darker aspects of Irish history. So, for example, we're in the Liberties area. We don't shy away from the fact that it had a really kind of dark and mysterious past. So we try to introduce people to a different angle instead of a highly polished version of Irish history.
Such as?
The fact that we were the best red light district in Europe in the 1800s in the Liberties area. The fact that we talk a lot about murder and prostitution. I mean, even if you look at some of our whiskies in our range, we have Murder Lane, we have Copper Alley, which is based on a story of one of the most famous brothels in Europe at the time, which was located in this neighbourhood. And we have Keeper's Coin, which is talking about essentially having speakeasy-esque bars in a crypt.
That works.
Yeah, I think we've covered a couple of bases that other whiskey brands might be a little bit nervous to dip their toe into. I also feel like a hefty sprinkle of finger guns and enthusiasm helps to keep us pretty good for tourists.
Americans accounted for 34% of distillery visits during 2022, Germany 9.5%, Great Britain 9%. The numbers are expected to grow this year when 26 distilleries will be open to the public for tours. In other news, Diageo shares took a tumble Thursday after the drinks giant reported earnings for the first half of the fiscal year, even though there was a 12% jump in pre-tax profits. Markets were concerned because Scotch whisky sales in the U.S. were off from a year ago, including a 10% drop in Johnnie Walker's sales and a 12% drop for Buchanan's. Single malt sales jumped in the U.S. by 61%, though, led by a strong showing for Lagavulin. Diageo executives told analysts the drop was because of stronger-than-usual sales during the same period in 2021 as the U.S. was coming out of lockdown. They expect sales to bounce back in the second half of this year. Diageo shares ended the week down 1.4% in London trading. Sazerac is facing a class action lawsuit over its Fireball Cinnamon product. The plaintiffs claim Fireball Cinnamon's labeling is misleading because it confuses consumers into thinking the malt-based drink contains real whiskey. Sazerac sells Fireball Cinnamon in gas stations and other stores without full liquor licenses that allow whiskey sales. It's made from a combination of malt and wine with whiskey flavoring and other, quote, natural flavors added. The lawsuit claims the ingredient list is worded so that it looks like Fireball Cinnamon is made with actual whiskey, just like the Fireball Cinnamon whiskey that's sold in liquor stores. Sazerac has a policy of not commenting on pending litigation. Michter's is releasing just its fourth batch ever of Celebration Sour Mash whiskey in February. The release was originally scheduled for last fall in time for the holidays, but supply chain issues delayed the packaging for the $6,000 bottles. It's a blend of 3 barrels of Michter's bourbon and 4 barrels of Michter's rye, ranging in age from 12 to over 30 years old. Bowmore and Aston Martin have teamed up for a new travel retail series. The 3-bottle set includes new 10, 15, and 18-year-old expressions. Each one features a different vintage Aston Martin car on the label. There's no word on pricing. And finally, we've reported in the past on experiments in which small samples of whiskey were sent to the International Space Station to study differences in maturation in zero gravity. Now comes the logical, if slightly over-the-top conclusion, sending entire barrels of whiskey into orbit to spend a year maturing in space. North Carolina's Mystic Farm and Distillery hopes to send 5 barrels into orbit for at least a year, before bringing them back to Earth to be bottled as Mystic Galactic. They'll be compared to the same distillate kept here on Earth in what will be called the ground control bottling. For $75,000, the buyer gets an NFT that will entitle them to 1 bottle of Galactic whiskey, along with access to special experiences around the launch and recovery of the whiskey. While they don't have a rocket provider or any concrete plans yet, Mystic's Jonathan Blitz is hoping to launch early next year.
Where we stand right now is we have a group of qualified launch services vendors and orbiter vendors. We have a good idea of the budget for the launch. We have the bourbon, of course, is going to be selected from our aging stock. We have a few hundred barrels aging at any given time, and we'll be able to pick some nice 3-plus-year-old barrels for that. And in a few weeks, we're going to drop the NFT, which will take the purchase deposits. We'll take those deposits and put them into a FDIC-insured bank account, and then we will begin preparation for the mission. We're hoping to launch January, February of 2024, but it is space travel, so sometimes you can't be too sure when the project's going to go to launch. But we have some launch windows there, and we were very excited about getting it done on time there.
That's an ambitious schedule. How confident are you that you can actually make this happen in less than a year?
I think we can. One of the beautiful parts of this, and what's really enabled us to go to market with it, is this is sort of the spring season of commercial space ventures. You're in a time when the cost of launching a kilogram into the kind of orbit that we need to get to has dropped by a factor of 5. You have off-the-shelf heat shield solutions for reentry. There are qualified vendors for parachutes that can land an orbiter. You have proven orbiter designs that are available from a multitude of vendors. I think we're in a good position to do this, and I don't think, to me, the technical issues are really not where everything gets tricky. I think some of it is just managing a project like that and keeping it on time and getting it done expeditiously, and also creating a really incredible purchase experience for the people involved. Make sure they're with us every step of the way through multimedia and from the mission and things like that. But, you have over 100 commercial rocket launches a year just from SpaceX alone. So getting it up to orbit is really almost trivial at this point. You pay your money and you get your launch.
Purchasers of the $75,000 NFTs will get their money back if Mystic cannot deliver the bourbon as promised. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com. The news is brought to you by the Dalmore.
Hello, Richard Patterson here, Master Distiller, Master Blender for the Dalmore. Whenever the team and I are in the world sharing our exceptional single malt, we like to keep in touch with Mark Gillespie and the latest news from WhiskyCast. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events.
The Whiskey Global Festival is this Friday night in Vancouver, British Columbia. Edel Dropper, the One Glass Festival, is Saturday in Stavanger, Norway. Next weekend brings us Whiskey Spring in Schwetzingen, Germany, and the Highlander Whiskey Festival in Alkmaar, the Netherlands. Catoctin Creek Distillery hosts a Valentine's dinner February 17th at the distillery in Purcellville, Virginia, and the Vienna Whiskey Convention is on the 17th in Vienna, Austria. If you're organizing a whiskey event, please let us know about it, and we'll add it to the calendar at whiskycast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Kentucky and Ireland have plenty in common. Two homes of horse racing. Bluegrass music is said to have Irish roots. Okay, it's not the longest list, but the Redbreast Kentucky Oak Edition only strengthens the bond. Finished in sustainably sourced Kentucky oak for a captivating nose and round taste. I see a triple crown in this thoroughbred's future.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Mortlock and the Classic Malts lineup. We're bombarded with marketing speak every day, with all kinds of claims about what's the best, the most authentic products on the market. But what really defines authenticity? It turns out it's in the eye of the beholder, especially when it comes to whiskey. Professors Glenn Carroll of Stanford University and Cameron Verhaal of Tulane University did a study on authenticity in the craft distilling world recently. Their findings were published in the journal Poetics, and I talked with them on a Zoom call the other day. I guess the first thing we need to do is define our terms here. What exactly do you define as authenticity?
Well, that's a good question. And I guess our approach to it has been that we actually do not impose an analytical definition on the research we've done, but rather we ask people who are consuming products that they regard as authentic, what do they regard as authentic and why? And we take their word for it. If they perceive it as authentic, then in our eyes it is authentic, at least to them, and we look and see what impact that has.
Cameron, you want to jump in on that, or is that good?
I'll just add, to me, to try to put sort of if we had to put a definition on it, I think the broadest definition that I like to follow is just this general rule of you are what you claim to be, right? And there's Glenn, I don't know if he's a psychologist or sociologist, Erwin Goffman had this idea of the authenticity of the everyday self. And he used the analogy of a theater stage, a front stage and a backstage. And he basically said you're authentic to the extent that your front stage, what you project outwardly, matches your backstage, what your true self is. That's sort of the broadest sense. And then Glenn and others have been sort of pioneers in sort of creating this typology of what authenticity is specifically for management. I think what we try to do is try to keep it a little bit broad and then also stick to basically what Glenn said, right? We don't want to come over the top and tell people this is what authenticity is and then ask what their opinions is, because that may create problems. But whatever someone thinks is authentic, we sort of accept that and try to go with that.
Yeah, if you probe underneath and ask people why they call it authentic and look at the long literature and academics about this, there are two basic kinds of definitions, which are very, very different. The first is exemplified if I say, well, last night we went to a Thai restaurant and it was really authentic. There we're talking about a restaurant that has the cuisine, the ingredients, the atmosphere, the personnel, everything about it that conforms with what we regard as the symbols and signals and institutional codes that are associated with the Thai restaurant. And, those codes may vary by individuals across places, but you're basically saying it matches the code that I hold. The other way, which is quite different, is if I say, Mark Gillespie is a really authentic person. Of course, you're a person, so the code thing doesn't matter. But by being authentic there, it's closer to what Cameron's saying. It's that, you're someone who does what you say and think and believe, and you don't care so much about societal expectations around that. You're going to do what you think is right, and we can trust you to follow your own moral code rather than someone else's.
So why did you pick distilleries for this study?
Well, it's really an interesting domain because it's burgeoning right now with all the new micro distilleries. So you have hundreds of new entrants coming online in this industry that's been dominated by a few big players for a long time. And if you talk to those drinkers and ask them why they like the new micro distilleries, they'll give you all kinds of stories that to us sound like authenticity. I mean, some of them have to do with the product characteristics, the quality of the whiskey and things like that. But some of them have to do with, tradition, community, special types of recipes, going back to legacy methods and the like. So there, it has all the kind of look and feel of a social movement around authenticity.
I'm curious because we've had a lot of discussion about what is exactly authentic in craft distilling, and
sure,
over the last few years.
So I should also say it looks to us in many ways. Of course, it's different, but in many ways, like the American craft brewing movement, which we have both studied. And early in the American craft brewing movement, one of the things that you saw were a lot of so-called contract brewers, which were basically just marketing operations that outsource production of brewing to some, failing brewery most of the time. Even companies like Boston Beer Company and Sam Adams Lager, which was one of the leaders, that was outsourced, almost all of his production. And what happens is that the community develops around it, the enthusiasts who are looking for authenticity, they eventually find out that they're not making their own liquids, and that becomes a taboo thing. And so they start to get devaluated for it and figure out ways to get around it and wind up, either internalizing their own production or buying a company or something. And that's really, it seems like that's, but most of the contract brewers got pushed out of the craft brewing after a decade or two. It seems like a similar thing is going on in micro distilling, where a lot of these companies don't produce their own spirits. And, I guess if we had to predict, we'd say they may get pushed out of that too. It certainly seems to be a subject of a lot of discussion. Now, Cameron, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, to me, I think the interesting thing, I'm personally interested in sort of growth of these craft-based industries and identity-based industries and what happens when they grow beyond sort of the existing codes or schemas that sort of dictate what a real or an authentic distillery or brewery or farm-to-table restaurant is. And the distilling industry was interesting because a lot of people just assumed it would exactly follow the path of the craft beer industry just, 20 years later. And there's a lot of similarities, as Glenn pointed out, but, there are some differences. It's followed a little bit of a different path. I mean, the growth has been crazy. It's also much more common and much more accepted, or was more accepted, to be bought out by sort of a larger conglomerate. Whereas in the early years of the craft beer industry, that was the death knell. I mean, that was just absolute taboo. Now it's become a little bit more accepted over the last 10 years or so. So there are some significant differences. And I think there's a lot to be gained by looking at sort of these industries over time and trying to understand why they took different paths and sort of what are the underlying reasons for why that happened.
And of course, the economics differs a lot in distilling, to reach what most people think of as the really premium products. You have to age your production 5, 6, 7, 10, 12 years. And so you're basically tying up capital for a very long time. Whereas in brewing, the fresher the beer, the better. So aging it is not an issue at all. And so that really makes the economics very different.
And just one additional thing, if you're a new distillery founder and you want to immediately start offering sort of a dark spirit, right? You have to sort of outsource, or you have to rely on something else. Otherwise, you have to wait, X number of years before you can provide that offering. Whereas in the beer industry, once you're up and running, you dependent on your knowledge base, this sort of the sky's the limit with what the offerings that you want to provide.
A listener gave me this question to ask, and once a brand loses authenticity in the eyes of the public, how can it gain that back over time? What is What does a brand have to do to reclaim authenticity once it's lost?
Now, that's a really good question. I'd say most of the time it's not possible, or you don't see it happen very often. And I'm searching my mind trying to think of some examples where maybe it did. I would say if you get new ownership and they make a public pronouncement that they're going to go back to the roots and the origins and, what really mattered and things had gotten out of control the last so many years, that maybe with that kind of message and then some obvious signaling or transparency that shows that's what you're doing, then maybe you have a chance then. But, I think it's an uphill battle.
Yeah, I mean, I would second that. It's incredibly hard, right? Glenn has done some work on this notion that if you claim authenticity, that actually backfires and hurts you. So once you lose it, if you make this overt effort to try to regain it or get it back, I think people are immediately jaded and see that as sort of a disingenuous attempt. The other thing is, to gain authenticity in the first place takes a huge amount of time. To lose it and then gain it again, I don't know of any research that's looked at that, but I would imagine it'd be hard. I'm working on a paper sort of linking the authenticity literature to the strategy literature, and in strategy there are these concepts of what makes sort of these certain resources like authenticity so valuable and provide a inimitable strategic advantage. And a lot of it is because of these ideas of like time compression diseconomies, right? Like once you achieve authenticity, the amount of time that it takes for sort of competitors to sort of catch up with you on that front is just so onerous and so resource intensive that it becomes incredibly difficult. And it's the same. I would imagine it's the same to sort of recapture authenticity. Once you lose it, it would take inordinately more time to sort of recapture it than it would be to actually gain it in the first place.
I'm looking at some of the survey information that you asked folks about as part of your research. And it seems to me that among those who were surveyed, they regard grain to glass distilleries as most authentic compared to others, or they really emphasize distilling in-house. And you've talked about that, but explain how you came up with these survey questions that and what people thought about them when you did the work.
Well, so many of the questions that we asked were modeled after advertising or online stories that we read that distilleries were actually promulgating themselves. So, the online world's great because there's a lot more information available, obviously, but most companies who have a presence there, they have our story or something about our traditions, and they'll tell you what they want you to think. And we looked at those and compared those, and then crafted something based on those without using the exact same words in every case. As far as what they think, I mean, all we know is their survey response to it. Do they prefer this message to that message? Do they think this message is more authentic, represents transparency, or whatever? So there's no in-depth probing. These are online surveys.
I'm looking at this, and among the questions, the one that was least authentic were, we make our spirits using grains sourced from secret locations around the globe, is coming up as completely inauthentic.
Yeah. So that's, so some of these are kind of crazy. I mean, we had fun doing this, but, it's, the idea of a secret recipe handed down in the family and ingredients from some special place and a tradition in moonshine in your family, all of that is stuff that, some companies think appeals to people, and to some degree, I'm sure it does. But it, at least our findings were that it doesn't appeal nearly as much as being able to show them that you actually do the production yourselves and maybe even produce the grain, and you're involved in all aspects of the processing. So when people see that, they think that's an authentic distiller. Now, it's important to point out that, and they also often think that's associated with quality. But what's important to point out is that may or may not be associated with quality. We saw this in the early craft brewing too. It's like, you get some set of guys who've never done this before in their life, and they have some money and they go buy a farm and a still and they start making it on their own. Who's to say that that's necessarily going to be a better product quality-wise than if you outsource production to some company that's been making distilled spirits for decades, has a lot of expertise in-house, has done it many times, and has great technology. And you may control the recipe and tell them what to do, but you're not doing it yourself. But for whatever reason, the consumer sees that as inauthentic compared to doing it all yourself.
I was just going to add, I think for me at least, but I think for both of us, one of the motivations of this study is there's a lot of people that see authenticity as sort of this, again, unable to quantify, unable to define, unobservable characteristic. And there's actually research in the literature in psychology called essentialism that links sort of authenticity to this notion of an essence. So something that something is authentic to the extent that it taps into its true essence, and that essence is not tangible. It's you can't feel it and you can't taste it. And a lot of the questions that we were asking were sort of counterpoints to this really tangible outsourcing component. We were trying to get at this essence to actually test and see whether that resonated with consumers. So again, secret family recipes. Something was distilled in a prohibition style still that was used, back in the woods somewhere 150 years ago. Even something more commonly known as terroir, which I think is really widely accepted, but still, it's not nearly as tangible as a lot of these other sort of markers. So we were trying to sort of understand different notions of sort of what was authentic, also what was sort of existing in the current literature, and that sort of guided the questions as well.
The story doesn't always meet the quality expectation, is what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What can we take from this and learn from it? What can we learn from your research?
Well, from our point of view, if you're running a company, if you're actually a distiller, I think it gives you a lot of advice about what to do and not do if you want to grow your market. If you want to be some company that the enthusiasts such as you admire and think of as a great company and doing something unique, it seems like you want to control your own production. You want to make that very transparent to others, and you want to do heritage methods that are visible and show that to people every opportunity you get. That's much better than coming up with some story about, family tradition, moonshine, background, and a secret recipe, secret locations for and all that stuff. So there's that. On the consumer side, I don't know exactly what the implications are, I guess. I think people should drink what they like and what they think is enjoyable and pleasant, and there's no accounting for other people's tastes. That's what makes a diverse marketplace, so that's great. But it may be useful to know what other consumers regard as authentic, so that you at least understand where your tastes lie in the overall preference structure of the world, and to understand if you're unusual or you're just like everybody else. I always find it funny that you have all these highly educated, affluent people who spend all this time, figuring out what's the best whiskey or beer or wine, or what they like, and, having all these complicated judgments about it, and yet winding up in the same space. It's almost predictable what they're going to do. So it's based on their social position. So it's not like we're not as unique as we often think we are.
I think one of the big takeaways, and we've talked about this a little bit already, is that it's not easy, right, to be considered authentic. And one of the key parts of our research and our paper shows that these commitments to the distillery or any other organization has to be costly. You have to show that you're putting great effort and cost into these types of things. And the cost is not just money. It could be money, but it's time, it's effort, it's love, it's attention. And those are the types of things, those costly commitments to what you're doing are sort of what relate on the organizational side. So I don't think we want this to be sort of a prescriptive in the sense that, oh, here's the most efficient and effective way to be considered authentic, right? We're just saying these are the types of things that ideally resonate with consumers. And those aren't always the quickest and easiest paths to success. But if you want to be considered authentic, then these are at least some suggestions we could give.
I think one other thing is, people are often surprised when, you read a newspaper story or magazine story about blind taste tests that wind up showing that, some very highly regarded products don't do very well in these blind taste tests and some unknown ones do. Those are really interesting because what they're showing to me, my interpretation is that, the objective characteristics of the product are not necessarily driving consumers' evaluation. It's a whole story around it. And once you separate the story from the product itself, the evaluation changes significantly for many people.
Is there anything else you can add that I didn't ask about?
I'm amazed by microdistilling, as Cameron mentioned, the dramatic growth, but also the diversity and the creativity and innovation. And, we've seen this. When I first started studying craft brewing, you saw a little bit of this, but they were mainly trying to bring back traditional methods and heritage recipes and things like this. But now you look at craft brewing, the stuff Cameron looks at is like, it's one of the most creative, it's certainly the most creative brewing industry in the world. It's probably one of the most creative industries that's that old anywhere. It's just amazing. And with distillers, it seems like they're doing that right off the block. There's really a lot of interesting, unusual stuff there. And I just think we're going to see more and more of that. It's really, really terrific.
Yeah, and I would just add to follow up on the consumer side. We talked about how authenticity and quality don't necessarily always correlate. And I think that's important for consumers to keep in mind, right? I think a lot of aspiring aficionados in any sort of market feel like they have to sort of make purchasing decisions based on sort of what others tell them is authentic or what others tell them is something good. And just going in knowing that even the most authentic products aren't necessarily the highest quality products. So as Glenn said, it's important to sort of to drink what you prefer and you like, irrespective of sort of the underlying authenticity. Now, if authenticity is important to you, then that's part of the overall experience, but it doesn't really mean that you know what you're talking about with respect to quality of these products.
Thanks to Professor Glenn Carroll of Stanford and Cameron Verhaal of Tulane for joining us this week on WhiskyCast In-Depth. It's brought to you by Mortlach, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies, comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlach lineup at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. Let's start off with the latest release of Catoctin Creek's Rabble Rouser Rye. This bottled in bond 100% rye whiskey is bottled at 50% ABV, of course. The nose has touches of nectarines, baking spices, sandalwood, honey, and a hint of tobacco. The taste is thick and chewy with notes of peaches, nectarines, clove, cinnamon, and white pepper, along with a hint of cherry pipe tobacco. The finish fades slowly to a subtle dry and nutty finish. I'm scoring the Catoctin Creek Rabble Rouser Rye a 92. Next up, let's look at the Old Particular Dalyuen 12-year-old from Douglas Lang & Company's Midnight Series. It's bottled at 57.8% ABV. The nose has toasted vanilla, butterscotch, honey, charred oak, and tobacco notes. The taste is thick and oily with a citrusy tartness and touches of white pepper, honey, toasted vanilla, and charred oak. The finish? It's long with a lingering citrusy tartness and just a hint of spice. I'm scoring the Old Particular Dalyuen 12-year-old from Douglas Lang & Company a 91. Finally, I had a chance to taste Nikka's new Taketsuru Pure Malt the other day. It's a blend of malts from the Yoichi and Miyagikyo distilleries, and it's bottled at 43% ABV. The nose has touches of vanilla, toasted oak, and dried flowers, along with a nice maltiness and hints of honey, smoke, and citrus. The taste is tart and citrusy with grilled pineapple, a hint of smoke, lemon zest, and dried flowers. The finish is long and tart, and I'm scoring the Nikka Taketsuru Pure Malt an 89. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit, a 150-time award-winning Maryland-style rye whiskey. With a determined focus to create the best rye whiskey imaginable, Sagamore's team of distillers crafts each spirit with a nod to both tradition and innovation. Find their signature Double Oak, Cask Strength, or Reserve Series rye whiskeys, as well as their line of premium rye whiskey canned cocktails, at a retailer near you. Visit sagamorespirit.com/find-rye. Please drink responsibly.
Gabriel Cardarella again, here to tell you about the all-new Dewar's 12-year-old Scotch Whisky. Crafted by Dewar's 4-time IWSC Master Blender of the Year, Stephanie McLeod, the new Dewar's 12-year is now double-aged in first fill premium bourbon casks. It's full of red apples and peaches on the nose, hints of lemon zest and floral notes and subtle spice that'll expand into an incredibly lush, fruity character before you hit that long, creamy finish full of butterscotch and vanilla. It's no wonder that Mark and the good folks at WhiskyCast gave this whiskey a 94-point rating. Just what you'd expect from the world's most awarded blended Scotch whiskey, Dewar's.
Let's open up the inbox now for Your Voice, presented by Scarabus Islay Single Malt Scotch Whisky. I mentioned the Mystic Galactic project on Twitter the other day. Turns out I'm not the only one who's just a bit skeptical. From the Southwest Somme, this is just nonsense. From @Intoxicated Masculinity, this is great information for con men. If they see this bottle in someone's house, then it's clear they're a mark. And from Bunkai H, with a wink, it can ride in the Tesla that's already up there. If there's something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always look for me on social media. Just check for WhiskyCast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, or just email me. The address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your Voice is presented by Scarabus, the Islay single malt from Hunter Lang & Company that celebrates all of Islay's natural gifts in one bottle. Only those who seek shall find Scarabus. Start your search today at hunterlang.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and people who make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. This week we're going to meet Jerry Dalton. Now, who is he? Well, he's the only master distiller in Jim Beam history who wasn't a member of the Beam family. He was master distiller after Booker Noe retired in 1995 and before Fred Noe was promoted to master distiller in 2008. That was after Jerry had to step down to take care of his wife, who was suffering from dementia. I asked Jerry the other day about what it was like to be the only non-Beam master distiller at Jim Beam.
The whole thing was surreal for me. It never occurred to me that I would ever rise that far in the ranks of bourbon making, and so it's just an amazing honor, amazing privilege, and a lot of fun.
You were in that interim period between Booker Noe and Fred Noe, but you never got your picture on the bottle, unlike Fred and Booker both, right?
Well, I had the whole wrong kind of blood running in my veins. I wasn't a family member, and so I never quite made it up in the lights.
The folks at the ABV Network have put together a film about Jerry's life and his career with the very subtle title, Put Jerry Dalton in the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame. It's available to watch online, and Steve Ackley explains why Jerry Dalton deserves more recognition than he's received.
Jerry was the caretaker for his wife, and I knew that's the reason why he wasn't involved in the industry. So his wife suffering from dementia, he was her sole caretaker. He didn't, put her in a home or anything. He took care of her. And ultimately that keeps him out of the limelight. He doesn't have the ability to go out and do interviews and be at events and things like that. We met him for lunch one time, Royce Neely of Neely Family Distillery and he had to have his daughter come in and stay with Jerry's wife at that time. He literally couldn't leave the house even for half an hour. So it was important for me to make sure that bourbon fans know who he is, understands the legacy. And then we have this backdrop of, it'd be cool if he can get into the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame, but it doesn't have to be. That's not a success. That's not the only means of success for this movie. If we can put this together like we did and present it and introduce it to bourbon fans, what he has done for the industry, I think that's the win. That's the takeaway. And ultimately, I'm already on top of the world because Jerry likes the movie. And, to me, that's why we did it, to show Jerry that people do care about what he did for the industry, even though today's bourbon fans don't know who he is, but they just because he wasn't out there. He didn't get to be part of all this boom and growth over social media and stuff.
Now, here's how someone gets into the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame. For years, each of the Kentucky Distillers Association member companies got one nomination per year, along with the board of the Kentucky Bourbon Festival, with the KDA board deciding which nominees were worthy of being inducted. Last year, that changed. While the KDA member companies still nominate candidates, a panel made up of past Parker Beam Lifetime Achievement Award winners votes on the nominees. This year's nominees will be inducted in September at the start of the Kentucky Bourbon Festival, but whether Jerry Dalton gets an invitation to that luncheon or not, he's just happy to be considered.
Well, mind you, this is something that Steve brought to me. I didn't bring it to him, and I hadn't really had the time or inclination to think much about it. It'd be a great honor, and if it happens, I'll be truly grateful to Steve and to the people who make that decision. So it would be something I can put on the wall and look at and be pleased with myself. And I try not to be too ego-laden, but that'll polish up the old ego a little bit. I think it would be a great honor.
We've posted a link to the online video of Put Jerry Dalton in the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame in the show notes for this episode at whiskeycast.com. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskeycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot, an 18th century style of premium Irish whiskey, blended from single pot still and single malt. Like yourself, it's one of life's treasured rarities, and what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copper Pot.
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskeycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and, of course, a complete archive of our past episodes going all the way back to 2005. Get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address, comments@whiskeycast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
The average college basketball power forward is 6'9", which, according to my rough calculations, is 16.5 times my height. I'll stick to aimlessly pottering around in back gardens.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast, Redbreast. Pass it on.
Me again, Gabe with Dewar's, encouraging you to seek out the new Dewar's 12-year-old and experience it for yourself. Until next time, friends, we wish you all the best from everyone here at Dewar's, and please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2023, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.